The night sky over the eastern Mediterranean has been transformed into a tapestry of fire and kinetic energy, as Tel Aviv and Haifa currently endure the most sophisticated and devastating coordinated strike package witnessed since the inception of this fictional conflict. In the last 6 hours, the operational landscape of the war has shifted fundamentally, moving away from the high-volume, demonstrative volleys of the early weeks toward a lethal, mathematically precise sequence of infrastructure degradation. This is not merely an emotional outburst or a desperate retaliation by Iranian forces. It is a calculated masterpiece of military engineering designed to overwhelm the physical and psychological capacity of the Israeli state. Reports from the ground indicate that Tel Aviv is facing a massive conflagration across its industrial sectors, while the Port of Haifa, the nation's primary maritime lifeline, is engulfed in flames following a saturated drone engagement. The sheer timing of these events reveals the strategic depth of the operation. By launching ballistic missiles at Tel Aviv simultaneously with drone swarms targeting the northern coast, Iran has forced the Israeli air defense network to split its focus across a massive geographic spread within a narrow 40-minute window. This tactical choice was specifically designed to exceed the processing limits of the Arrow and David's Sling systems, forcing commanders to make impossible choices about which incoming threats to prioritize and which to allow through to their targets. The assault on Tel Aviv utilized a heavy mix of Kheibar, Sejjil-2 and Sejjil-2 ballistic missiles, each directed toward 3 critical pillars of urban functionality. The first target category involved the power relay and transmission hubs, situated on the eastern fringes of the metropolitan sprawl. This was a deliberate attempt to replicate the success of the infamous Wave 54 strike, which previously plunged 11 million people into a total blackout. By hitting these nodes again, the attackers are ensuring that any fragile repairs made to the grid are permanently undone, pushing the city back into a primitive state of darkness. The second category of targets focused on the northern highway, interchanges, and arterial road corridors. This was not about killing civilians directly, but about paralyzing the city's logistics. By cratering these specific junctions, the Iranian planners have effectively blocked the movement of emergency vehicles, fire crews, and military reinforcements. A city that cannot move its resources is a city that cannot defend its wounded or resupply its frontline units. Finally, the third category involved the systematic destruction of communications relay infrastructure, including cellular towers and fiber optic routing centers. This coordinated hit on the digital nervous system of Tel Aviv has severely hampered both civilian coordination and the secure military networks that rely on these terrestrial nodes for localized command and control. While Tel Aviv suffered under the weight of heavy ballistic impacts, Haifa was subjected to a fundamentally different form of warfare. Understanding the divergence in these tactics is essential to grasping the broader strategic objective. Haifa serves as the most significant maritime logistics hub in the region, acting as the primary entry point for everything from American-made interceptor components to the refined fuel required to keep hospital generators running. Rather than using fast-moving missiles, Iran deployed massive drone swarms against the port facilities. This choice was dictated by the specific vulnerabilities of a maritime environment. Drones, while slower than ballistic missiles, possess the ability to loiter, navigate between cranes, and strike specific fuel storage tanks with surgical precision that a high-speed terminal trajectory cannot match. The drones were utilized to dismantle the very equipment that makes a port functional: the massive container cranes, the specialized loading docks, and the intricate fuel piping systems. By targeting these assets, the goal was not to simply damage the shoreline, but to eliminate Israel's ability to receive the military and economic inputs required to sustain a long-term war effort. The destruction in Haifa represents a direct assault on the national supply chain, ensuring that even if the country has the will to fight, it will eventually lack the physical hardware and energy resources to do so. The synergy between these two strikes creates a compounding crisis that far exceeds the sum of its individual parts. When the power grid in Tel Aviv fails at the exact moment the road networks are severed, the result is a total systemic collapse. Hospitals currently operating on backup diesel power now find themselves unable to receive fuel deliveries because the trucks are stuck behind destroyed highway interchanges. Emergency responders attempting to reach fire zones in the port of Haifa find their communications devices silent because the relay towers in the south have been neutralized. This is multi-node infrastructure targeting at its most lethal level. It creates a feedback loop of failure where the degradation of one system accelerates the collapse of the next. Iranian military planners clearly understood that by hitting these two specific cities with these specific weapon sets, they could create a state of functional paralysis that spreads from the urban centers to the National Defense Command. The immediate humanitarian consequences are staggering, as the basic services required for survival, water, light, and communication, are being stripped away in a single 6-hour window of total war. To understand how the conflict reached this level of intensity, one must look back at the evolution of Iranian strike doctrine over the past several months. This campaign did not start with this level of precision. When Operation True Promise 4 was initiated in late February, the opening salvos were defined by raw volume and a broad geographic footprint. The early objective was largely psychological and demonstrative. Iran needed to prove to the world and to its adversaries that it could strike anywhere at any time. In those initial 72 hours, despite the destruction of over 1,000 Iranian assets by American and Israeli preemptive strikes, the waves continued to launch on schedule. This established a baseline of operational resilience, signaling that the Iranian military could absorb massive punishment and still maintain a sustained tempo of fire. For 26 days and over 80 consecutive waves, the message was one of inexhaustible inventory. However, volume was never the ultimate goal. It was the prerequisite for the strategic refinement we are seeing tonight. Those early waves served a dual purpose. They depleted the Israeli stockpile of expensive interceptors, and they conditioned the civilian population to a cycle of constant alerts, slowly wearing down the alertness and discipline of the entire nation. By the time the Sejjil-2 was introduced in Wave 54 against the power grid, the defensive environment had been significantly degraded. Every interceptor fired at a cheap drone in Week 1 was an interceptor that was not available to stop a ballistic missile in Week 10. This strategy of attrition has led directly to the current crisis. Israel now finds itself in a position of interceptor scarcity, where every launch is a high-stakes gamble. The Western production lines, though running at maximum capacity, simply cannot bridge the gap between the rate of consumption and the rate of replenishment. This exhaustion of resources is exactly what allowed tonight's strikes on Tel Aviv and Haifa to be so successful. When the defensive shield is thin, simultaneous attacks on multiple cities force a catastrophic failure in the protection of critical infrastructure. The Iranian planners waited until the interceptor inventory reached a critical low point before deploying this coordinated dual city strike, ensuring that the maximum number of warheads would reach their intended targets. Furthermore, the psychological state of the target population has become a primary factor in the war's progression. After weeks of living in shelters and hearing the constant drone of sirens, a phenomenon of psychological saturation has taken hold. Data suggests that response times to alerts have slowed, and the disciplined adherence to safety protocols has begun to fray under the weight of exhaustion. People are no longer retreating to shelters with the same urgency they showed on day one. Iran is capitalizing on this fatigue, striking at a moment when the civilian shield is at its weakest. This is a cold, calculated use of human psychology as a battlefield variable. By hitting the most populated areas during a period of deep national exhaustion, the attackers are maximizing the internal pressure on the Israeli government to find an immediate, perhaps even reckless, solution to the conflict. The current strikes also target infrastructure that is already in a state of partial ruin. Each new impact on a power station or communication hub lands on a system that has been hastily patched together from previous engagements. This cumulative damage is much harder to repair than the original destruction. The specialized components required for high-voltage transformers or fiber optic junctions are in short supply, and the active combat environment makes the deployment of repair crews a life-threatening endeavor. Consequently, the rate of infrastructure decay is now outpacing the rate of restoration. Iran is effectively hitting a wounded organism, ensuring that the damage compounds at an exponential rate. Every fire burning in the Port of Haifa and every darkened street in Tel Aviv represents a widening gap in the national capacity to function. As we move into the next phase of this analysis, we will look deeper into the specific weapon systems and the global economic tremors caused by the burning of the Haifa docks. The world is watching a modern state being systematically dismantled, node by node, in real time. The selection of specific ordnance for this dual city operation reveals a sophisticated understanding of kinetic utility that was absent in the early, more chaotic stages of this fictional war. To appreciate the gravity of the current situation in Tel Aviv, one must look at the physics of the ballistic missiles employed. The combination of the Kheibar and the Sejjil-2 represents a high-energy solution to a high-resistance problem. These systems are designed for terminal velocity and steep approach angles, making them nearly impossible to intercept once they enter their final descent phase. Their purpose in Tel Aviv was not to loiter or search, but to deliver massive warheads to hardened infrastructure points with enough kinetic force to ensure structural failure even if the detonation is not a direct hit. When a Sejjil-2 impacts a power relay station or a highway interchange, the shockwave alone is enough to sever underground fiber optic lines and crack the foundations of adjacent buildings. By using these heavy assets against the metropolitan center, the attackers ensured that the restoration of services would not be a matter of replacing a few wires, but of rebuilding entire concrete and steel skeletons from the ground up. This is the definition of strategic degradation, hitting the nodes that are the most expensive and time-consuming to replace. Conversely, the choice to use drone swarms against the Port of Haifa demonstrates an entirely different tactical philosophy. While ballistic missiles are blunt force instruments, drones are scalpel-like in their application within a complex maritime environment. The architecture of a modern port is a labyrinth of exposed machinery, specialized fuel lines, and massive top-heavy cranes. A ballistic missile hitting a dock might create a large crater, but it might miss the specific control electronics of a container crane. A drone, however, can loiter over the harbor for extended periods, identifying the most vulnerable components of the logistics chain. We have seen reports of loitering munitions specifically targeting the operator cabins and cable drums of Haifa's massive gantry cranes. Without these cranes, the port ceases to be a logistics hub and becomes merely a stretch of inaccessible concrete. Furthermore, the drones were directed at the fuel storage tanks that sit near the water's edge. These tanks feed the generators and the naval vessels that Israel relies on for coastal defense. By igniting these reserves, the drones have created a persistent, high-intensity fire that prevents emergency crews from even approaching the docks to assess the damage. The tactical brilliance of this weapon mix lies in its ability to exploit the specific weaknesses of the Israeli defense umbrella. The Arrow 3 system is designed to intercept high-altitude ballistic threats, but it is an incredibly expensive tool to use against a swarm of low-cost drones. If the defense commanders use their limited stockpile of interceptors to shoot down drones over Haifa, they leave Tel Aviv vulnerable to the Sejjil-2. If they prioritize the ballistic missiles, the drones are free to systematically dismantle the nation's primary shipping port. This is a classic Interceptor Dilemma engineered to perfection. By forcing this choice, the Iranian planners have ensured that at least one of their strategic objectives will be met with near certainty. In the last 6 hours, it appears both objectives were achieved. The sky over Haifa is thick with the black smoke of burning hydrocarbons, while the skyline of Tel Aviv is punctuated by the orange glow of infrastructure fires that have no hope of being extinguished while the roads remain impassable. The implications of the Haifa port strike extend far beyond the immediate tactical damage. Israel is a nation that operates as a floating island in economic terms. It has almost no land-based trade with its neighbors and relies entirely on maritime corridors for its survival. Haifa is the throat of the Israeli economy. Every liter of jet fuel, every replacement electronic component for the Iron Dome, and every shipment of raw materials for domestic munitions production must pass through those docks. There is no alternative entry point capable of handling the volume required to sustain a high-intensity conflict. The port at Ashdod is significantly smaller and sits much closer to the threat vectors emerging from the southern front, making it an even riskier proposition for international shipping companies. By effectively closing Haifa through drone-initiated fires and infrastructure collapse, the attackers have placed a metaphorical noose around the nation's logistics. Even if the United States and European allies were to double their current resupply efforts, the hardware would have nowhere to land. The bridge of ships that has sustained the Israeli military is being cut off at the destination point. This maritime blockade via kinetic strikes creates a compounding crisis for the Israeli Air Force and the ground defense units. Modern warfare is a game of high-speed consumption. Interceptors are used by the hundreds, and fuel is burned by the millions of liters. When the replenishment of these resources is slowed by even 20%, the operational tempo of the entire military begins to stutter. If Haifa remains non-functional for more than a week, the defensive batteries guarding Jerusalem and Tel Aviv will have to start rationing their shots. This leads to a terrifying reality, a defense system that becomes less effective the more it is needed. This is the depletion curve that the Iranian military has been tracking since the start of the conflict. They are not looking for a single decisive battle. They are waiting for the moment when the Israeli defense system simply runs out of the physical means to resist. Tonight's strikes were designed to accelerate that timeline by months. Furthermore, we must consider the civilian impact of a port closure in a nation that imports the vast majority of its consumer goods. The psychological effect of knowing that the country's lifeline has been severed is profound. It leads to panic buying, the hoarding of resources, and a general breakdown in social cohesion. When people see the images of the Haifa docks in flames, they understand intuitively that the normalcy they have been trying to maintain is an illusion. The government's ability to project a sense of control is tied directly to the functionality of its infrastructure. When that infrastructure fails so publicly and so violently, the social contract begins to strain. The domestic political pressure on the leadership in Jerusalem is reaching a boiling point as citizens demand a level of protection that the military, hamstrung by interceptor shortages and logistical bottlenecks, can no longer provide with total certainty. As the fires continue to burn, the international community is reacting with a mixture of shock and paralysis. The United States has redirected its carrier-based assets to conduct urgent counter-TEL, transporter erector launcher, missions across the Iranian interior. These missions are designed to hunt down the mobile units that launched tonight's ballistic missiles. However, the geography of Iran works heavily in favor of the attacker. The territory is vast, mountainous, and riddled with hardened underground facilities known as missile cities. For every launcher the Americans managed to destroy, 3 more emerge from a different mountain range. The sheer scale of the Iranian launch infrastructure makes it impossible to neutralize through air power alone without a massive multi-month campaign that would risk a much wider global conflagration. The cat-and-mouse game in the Iranian desert is a lopsided one, where the mouse has 1,000 holes and the cat has a limited number of eyes in the sky. The global economic repercussions are already manifesting in the pre-market trading sessions. Oil has surged past the $150 mark, and maritime insurance premiums for the eastern Mediterranean have tripled in the last 4 hours. Shipping conglomerates are already rerouting vessels away from the region, fearing that Haifa is no longer a safe harbor. This is exactly what the Iranian planners intended, to make the cost of supporting Israel so high that the international community begins to fracture. Every dollar added to the price of a barrel of oil is a point of political pressure on Western governments. The war is no longer confined to the borders of the Levant. It is being fought in the gas stations of Europe and the boardroom meetings of Asian manufacturing giants. The burning of Haifa is a signal to the world that the era of localized conflict is over, and the era of global economic warfare via infrastructure targeting has begun. The immediate military reaction from the United States and its regional allies has been characterized by a frantic redirection of aerial surveillance and strike assets toward the Iranian interior. For the past several hours, carrier-based wings and long-range bomber groups have shifted their primary mission parameters from general deterrence to an aggressive, high-priority hunt for the mobile transporter erector launchers, TELs, responsible for the Tel Aviv strikes. However, the operational reality on the ground highlights a fundamental asymmetry that has plagued Western intervention efforts throughout this fictional conflict. Iran's launch infrastructure is not a centralized network of static silos that can be neutralized in a single night of precision bombing. Instead, it is a distributed, highly mobile architecture spread across a rugged geography roughly the size of Western Europe. Every time an American satellite or drone identifies a potential launch signature, the target, a truck-mounted ballistic missile system, has usually already displaced into a hardened mountain tunnel or a camouflaged urban hide site before a strike package can be cleared for engagement. This cat-and-mouse game in the Iranian highlands is exacerbated by the sheer number of decoys and dummy launchers that have been prepositioned to soak up expensive Western munitions. For every successful strike on a genuine Kheibar or Sejjil-2 platform, intelligence suggests that dozens of fiberglass replicas are targeted, resulting in a depletion of Allied precision-guided bombs without a corresponding decrease in the enemy's offensive capacity. The drone launch platforms used against Haifa present an even greater challenge. These systems are significantly smaller than ballistic missile transporters. They can be operated from the back of civilian-style box trucks or even small maritime vessels, making them nearly indistinguishable from ordinary commercial traffic until the moment of launch. The inability to achieve sensor-to-shooter dominance over such a vast and obscured battle space means that despite the intensity of the Allied response, the waves of fire directed at Tel Aviv and Haifa are likely to continue as long as the Iranian inventory holds out. On the diplomatic front, the dual-city strike has acted as a catastrophic kinetic veto against the ongoing mediation efforts led by Pakistan. For weeks, back-channel communications in Islamabad had been making incremental, quiet progress toward a potential de-escalation framework. There were whispers of a phased ceasefire that would trade a lifting of certain maritime restrictions for a halt in Iranian missile waves. However, the smoke rising from the Haifa docks has effectively choked the life out of those negotiations. No Israeli government, facing the visual reality of its primary economic artery in flames and its largest metropolitan center in darkness, can politically afford to remain at a negotiating table. The domestic outcry in Jerusalem is no longer just for defense, but for a total, uninhibited retaliation that targets the very heart of the Iranian state's survival. The Pakistani intermediaries have reportedly gone silent in the last 4 hours, recognizing that the red lines of both combatants have been erased by the scale of tonight's destruction. The rhetoric emerging from the White House further complicates the path toward a ceasefire. Declarative statements have been issued characterizing the strikes on civilian infrastructure as an unacceptable escalation that demands a commensurate response. While the official language remains focused on degrading launch capabilities, the subtext suggests that the United States is being pulled deeper into a direct kinetic confrontation with Iran to prevent a total collapse of the regional security architecture. There is a growing gap between the declarative public confidence of Western leaders and the grim operational reports coming from the Eastern Mediterranean. While the public is told that the situation is being managed, the reality is that the interceptor depletion rates for the Arrow and Patriot batteries have reached a critical threshold. If another wave of the same magnitude as tonight's occurs within the next 48 hours, the defensive shield over central Israel may suffer a functional blackout, where targets are tracked but cannot be engaged simply because there are no missiles left in the tubes. This brings us to the harrowing humanitarian and systemic crisis unfolding within the targeted cities. In Tel Aviv, the destruction of the highway interchanges has created a gridlock of agony. Emergency services are attempting to reach collapsed buildings and burning power substations, but they are finding the arterial roads blocked by deep craters and twisted steel. The city's medical infrastructure, which is among the best in the world, is being tested beyond its design limits. Hospitals are running on internal power, but the electronic systems that manage patient data and surgical theater environments are failing due to the localized destruction of fiber optic nodes. This is the multi-node effect in its most cruel form. A surgeon cannot operate without light. Light cannot be maintained without fuel, and fuel cannot reach the hospital because the roads are gone. The trauma is not just physical, it is a total systemic failure of the modern urban environment. In Haifa, the situation is perhaps even more dire from a long-term perspective. The fires at the port are not just burning cargo, they are melting the specialized infrastructure required for the nation's survival. A modern container crane is a highly sophisticated piece of machinery that cannot be replaced by an off-the-shelf substitute. Each gantry destroyed represents a months-long lead time for manufacturing and installation. The drone swarms targeted the soft components, the control electronics, the hydraulic pumps, and the operator cabins, that are the hardest to source during a global supply chain crisis. By disabling the port, the attackers have ensured that even if a ceasefire were signed tomorrow, the economic recovery of the state would be delayed by years. The port is currently a dead zone of toxic smoke and secondary explosions from fuel bunkers, preventing any meaningful damage assessment. The global markets have reacted to this dead zone with unprecedented volatility. Shipping companies, which had already been wary of the Eastern Mediterranean, are now issuing force majeure declarations, effectively canceling all scheduled arrivals to Israeli waters for the foreseeable future. This is a de facto maritime blockade achieved without a single Iranian warship ever leaving its pier. The insurance industry, the silent engine of global trade, is effectively withdrawing coverage for any vessel operating within the strike radius of Iranian drone swarms. For a country like Israel, which relies on the sea for 98% of its trade by volume, this is an existential threat. The price of basic commodities, from grain to electronics, is expected to skyrocket within the next 72 hours, as the Haifa bottleneck takes full effect. As the world watches the fires burn, a deeper realization is beginning to take hold among strategic analysts. The theory of deterrence that governed the region for decades has been proven obsolete. The high-technology, high-cost defensive model favored by the West in Israel is being systematically dismantled by a low-cost, high-volume, and mathematically optimized offensive model. Iran is not trying to win a traditional war of maneuver. It is conducting a siege by physics, using the cumulative degradation of critical systems to break the back of a modern state. The next 72 hours will reveal whether the Israeli and American response can find a way to break this cycle, or if the new normal of burning cities and severed lifelines is here to stay. The psychological shield of the nation has been pierced, and the light of Tel Aviv is flickering out. The final trajectory of this 6-hour operational window points toward a grim reality that transcends the immediate smoke and fire, the total erosion of the technological and psychological sanctuary that has defined the modern Israeli state. As the fires in Tel Aviv's industrial sectors begin to merge into a single, localized firestorm, and the black plumes from Haifa's fuel bunkers drift toward the Galilee, the true intent of this coordinated strike becomes undeniable. It is a campaign of strategic exhaustion. By the time the final drone of the swarm impacted the Haifa gantry cranes, the Iranian military had successfully demonstrated that no amount of Western interceptor technology can indefinitely insulate a concentrated urban population from a mathematically optimized assault. The math of the attrition is cold and unwavering. When the cost of a single interceptor is measured in millions of dollars, and the cost of the attacking munition is measured in thousands, the defensive shield is not just being pierced, it is being bankrupted. This economic and material lopsidedness is the engine driving the conflict into its most dangerous phase yet, as the interceptor gap becomes a physical void in the sky over Israel's most populous districts. The human cost of this systemic degradation is now manifesting as a profound communal trauma. In Tel Aviv, the bubble of relative normalcy that persisted through the early weeks of the war has effectively burst. The sight of the city's glowing skyline being punctuated by the rhythmic impact of Sejjil-2 warheads has stripped away the last vestiges of perceived invulnerability. Families who once followed shelter protocols with disciplined calm are now facing the reality of a city that cannot guarantee power, water, or communication. This is the breaking of the adaptation cycle. When a population can no longer rely on the basic infrastructure of a 21st century city, the social contract begins to unravel. Reports are emerging of mass internal displacement as residents attempt to flee the metropolitan centers, only to find themselves trapped by the very highway craters designed to paralyze military movement. The irony of the situation is peak tragedy. The infrastructure built to facilitate the fastest growing economy in the region has become a series of concrete traps, locking the population into a zone of continuous bombardment. In Haifa, the destruction of the port has created a vacuum in the national survival strategy that cannot be filled by emergency airlifts alone. While the world focused on the dramatic explosions of the fuel tanks, the more subtle and devastating damage was done to the automated logistics systems and the specialized berth equipment. These are the silent casualties of the drone swarm. Without the digital architecture that manages container flow and the physical cranes that move the heavy hardware of war, Israel has been functionally decoupled from the global maritime grid. This is a kinetic blockade that bypasses the need for a traditional navy. By hitting the destination instead of the ships, Iran has achieved a strategic goal that has eluded regional powers for decades: the isolation of the Israeli state from its Western suppliers. The long-term implications for the nation's defense posture are catastrophic, as the just-in-time delivery of American interceptors and spare parts for the F-35 fleet is now subject to the extreme bottlenecks of a damaged and terrified shipping industry. The international response to these developments has reached a point of panicked urgency. Inside the Situation Room, the declarative language of the previous hours is being replaced by the sober assessment of a conflict that has no clear ceiling. The hunt for Iranian launch platforms continues, but with the sobering realization that for every mobile transporter destroyed, the Iranian production lines, shielded deep underground in the Zagros Mountains, are capable of replacing them. This is not a war that can be won through degradation alone if the enemy's capacity to produce exceeds the Allies' capacity to destroy. The global economic tremors are likewise intensifying. With Haifa non-functional and the Strait of Hormuz effectively under Iranian fire control, the energy tax on the global consumer is becoming a political liability for every Western leader. The pressure to force a resolution, any resolution, is mounting, even as the conditions for a stable ceasefire have been vaporized by tonight's events. As we look toward the next 72 hours, the fundamental question is no longer who will strike next, but what will be left to defend. The simultaneous burning of Tel Aviv and Haifa represents more than a military success for the attackers. It represents the end of an era of conventional deterrence. The world is watching the first true infrastructure war of the 21st century, where the objective is not the conquest of territory, but the systematic unmaking of a modern civilization's functional nodes. Israel remains resilient, its military remain lethal, and its people remain courageous. But the physical reality of the multi-node strike has altered the calculus of survival. The lights may eventually come back on in Tel Aviv, and the fires in Haifa may eventually be extinguished, but the confidence that they can be protected has been burned away. The conflict has entered a state of total kinetic immersion, and as the sirens begin to wail once more in the early morning light, it is clear that the shadow over the Mediterranean is only beginning to lengthen.